Hello guys, and welcome to tonight's journey into the past. This video explores the time of the plague. When the air grew heavy, the streets fell silent, and the world waited in stillness. Let your body relax, your breath slow down, and your thoughts drift away, because you were not born in the time of the plague. And by the time this story ends, you'll already be asleep, before the air thickened with worry, before footsteps vanished from the road, before the plague crept in like a shadow with no name. There was something else. There was a world, soft with life, and in that world, you might have heard the quiet sound of a wooden gate swaying in the wind. The year, no one remembers it anymore, but it was sometime long ago. The sun still rose, the moon still followed. In the countryside, far from kings and cities, villages dotted the hills like brushstrokes, homes of timber and mud, roofs of thatch and moss, windows without glass, just wooden shutters, hinged and weathered by rain. Inside, the hearth glowed orange, the fire crackled low, and someone stirred a pot with a spoon that had passed through generations of hands. Outside, chickens scratched the earth, cows chewed slowly in silence. The rhythm of life was slow, not sluggish, not lazy, but slow in the way rivers are, unrushed, unbothered, bound only to the turning of the seasons. Children rose with the light. They splashed cold water on their faces. They slipped their feet into rough shoes, and they stepped into the same morning their parents had once known. A bell would ring far off in a tower, not loud, just enough to remind the village that time was passing, that prayers would soon rise, and that bread was nearly ready. The bread, how it smelled, wheat and smoke and warmth, kneaded slowly, baked deep in stone. A loaf placed on the table meant the day had begun. The chickens had done their part. The hands had worked. The fire had held its promise. There were no clocks, only sun and shadow, only sound and silence. You knew the hour by the way the light hit the wooden beams in the ceiling, or the way a cart's wheel sounded as it rolled past a cottage door. Each house had a story. Each wall knew laughter and sorrow. Each chair had been carved by someone's grandfather, long since buried under the elder tree. There were no hospitals, no telegrams, no news from far away, and yet life continued. The blacksmith hammered, the miller ground the grain, the shepherd watched the sheep. From the same hill he had climbed since he was small, the sky was not always kind. Rain fell for days, frost bit the leaves, fields gave less than hoped. But no one expected comfort. Comfort in those days was the warmth of another body beside you, the softness of wool against skin, the simple knowledge that the fire was still burning. When you opened your eyes in the dark, the animals knew the rhythm too. The hens laid eggs when they pleased. The pigs rooted the earth for forgotten things. Even the dogs, half wild and half home, kept to the path they had always known. On Sundays, the bells rang longer. Families gathered, not just to pray, but to be together, to speak of the weather, to trade a piece of cloth for a sack of barley, to hear news from a cousin who lived 2 hills away. It was quiet joy. It was enough. And when night came, it was thick. Darkness fell like a curtain. There were no street lamps. Only the stars and the lanterns hung by doors. Inside, the family gathered close. A mother mended cloth. A father sharpened a blade. Children listened to stories that had no beginning and no end. Stories of wolves in the woods, of kings they'd never meet, of storms that had once lasted 40 days. And then came the silence, not the fearful kind, but the one that arrives when the world is ready to sleep. No carts, no voices, only the fire settling into coals and the wind grazing the shutters like fingertips. They did not know what would come. They did not see the shadow forming far across the sea. They did not hear the cough in the distant port. They did not yet feel the weight that history would place upon their village. For now they slept with the rhythm of a life passed down like a song, and the world for a little while longer was still whole. The morning came without noise, no alarm, no schedule, just a slow light of dawn spilling across the wooden floor. A pot sat above the fire. Steam rose. A spoon stirred. Oats thickened. A quiet breakfast began. Outside, the grass was wet with dew. A chicken clucked. A gate creaked open. Boots stepped through the yard. No one was in a hurry. There was no reason to rush. The tools leaned against the shed. The well held cool, clear water. A child carried a bucket with 2 hands. He didn't spill a drop. A woman hung linens on a line. The wind was gentle. The sun was soft. The cloth swayed. There were no phones, no wires, no distant voices asking for more. Only the trees, the wind, the steady breath of animals in the field. A man pulled weeds from the garden. He paused every few minutes, not because he was tired, but because there was time. Nothing pushed, nothing pulled. The day unfolded like a slow breath. The bell in the tower rang once, a soft, distant tone. Not a warning, just a rhythm, a reminder that morning had passed. And noon was near. Inside the cottage, a window was open. The curtain moved gently. A woman sat with a basket in her lap. She was stitching a patch onto a sleeve. The cloth was old, but it would last another season. No one complained. No one needed more. The door creaked once and stayed open. A breeze passed through. It smelled like hay and smoke. The table was set with bread and cheese. A knife rested in the middle. It had been used for many years, and it would be used for many more. 2 cups, 2 hands, 2 quiet people sitting down to eat. They did not speak much. There was nothing new to say, and yet everything was understood. After the meal, they sat still. There was no reason to move. The chores would wait. The sun was still high. A dog lay beside the door. His eyes closed. His ears twitched. A cart passed slowly in the distance. Its wheel thudded in the ruts of the road, then faded again. That was enough sound for one day. Later, the child would run through the grass, chasing nothing, laughing for no reason, falling down, getting back up. The chickens didn't mind. The goats didn't move. The sky turned a little more gold. By evening, smoke curled from chimneys again. A stew was stirred, bread was sliced, candles were lit. No one talked about tomorrow. No one needed to. The day had been enough. And the night would be quiet. Evening came quietly, not with noise, but with shadows, stretching across the ground. The sky turned to ash blue, then gray, then black. One star appeared, then two, then more than could be counted. The fire was lit, not large, just enough to warm the room. The chairs creaked gently as they sat. No words were needed. There was comfort in the stillness, a kind of peace. The room smelled like herbs and smoke. A bundle of dried lavender hung above the hearth. Its scent drifted slowly through the air. A woman stirred the pot again. Slow circles, careful hands. She had done this every night of her life. A child leaned on the table, eyes half closed, fingers tracing the grain of the wood. No games, no distractions, only the warmth of the room and the softness of now. Outside, the animals settled. The hens rustled once, then went quiet. The goat lay down. The dog curled at the door. A man sharpened a blade slowly, not because he needed to, but because it was something to do. He liked the sound it made, metal against stone, a rhythm like a memory. The candle on the table flickered. Its flame was small. Its light was enough. In the corner, a woman folded cloth. Nothing new, nothing exciting, but it felt good in the hands. It felt known. A bell rang in the distance, soft, lonely. Its sound echoed over the hills. It did not hurry anyone. It did not change the pace. The child yawned, eyes heavy, head leaning against her mother's arm. No fight, no fuss. She was lifted gently, cradled with care, carried toward the quietest room. A small bed, a wool blanket, a single carved toy, waiting on the pillow. She lay down without a word. The room was still. A breeze moved the curtain. A cricket sang. The woman stood by the door for a moment, watching, listening. Then she closed it slowly and walked back to the fire. The night had fallen, completely, but there was no fear, only calm. The stars held their place. The moon climbed high. The house creaked in the way it always did, and from every window the same glow, soft, golden, steady, a life without rush, a day without chaos, a night without noise. This was the way it had been for years, for generations, but change was coming. It was quiet now, unseen, still far away, but soon the silence would mean something else. The days were quiet, and the nights were softer still. People did not hurry. There was no need to. They lived by the sun and rested by the moon. There were no clocks, no deadlines, only time measured by the warmth of bread, the length of a shadow, or the hush of the evening sky. Children chased chickens through open fields. Men sat on wooden stools, carving spoons, mending shoes. Women hummed as they stirred the pot, not for music, but out of rhythm, the rhythm of knowing, the rhythm of doing what had always been done. And above it all, the wind passed slowly through the trees. The branches swayed, not in urgency, but in a patient dance that no one ever taught them. And yet they knew. Candles flickered in the windows. Doors were not locked. Feet were often bare. Laughter was small, but real. If there was pain, it was shared. If there was joy, it was quiet. There was no great wealth, no great power. But there was closeness, there was rhythm, there was peace. The old ones would sit by the fire, telling tales that had been told 100 times before. And yet the children listened, wide-eyed, quiet, as if hearing them for the first time. The roads were dirt, the roofs were thatch, the fields were wide, and the days moved slow, like honey poured from a wooden spoon. But something was shifting, not loud, not fast. It began like a murmur, a whisper carried in from the east, a name spoken once, then again, but no one quite remembered it. Merchants came through with less in their carts, eyes looking tired, stories left unfinished, and in the evening at the hearth, someone would mention a sickness far away, a town closed off, a port left empty. But then, silence. The fire would crackle, the pot would bubble, and life would continue, because this was the rhythm. And rhythms do not break until they do. So tonight, as your body relaxes, as your thoughts begin to drift, you are resting in that stillness, the stillness just before the wind changes, just before the silence speaks. You are lying in a world, on the edge of something vast, but for now, there is only calm, only rhythm, only breath, and when the story continues, you will already be far, far away, deep in the land of sleep, far from the time of the plague. The fire still crackled gently in the hearth. The wind still whispered through the trees, but something subtle had changed. It was in the way the air hung longer in the lungs, in the way the chicken stopped clucking all at once and then resumed, as if on command. It began as such things often do, quietly, softly, with no ceremony. A single cart creaked through the village road, its wheels muddied, its driver hunched low. No songs were sung, no goods announced, just the gentle thud of hooves on damp earth. No one remembered his face, only his gloves, worn even while eating. The baker's wife said he looked tired. The stable boy said his horse would not meet his eyes. The village priest said nothing at all. By dawn, the cart was gone. Days passed. Then another traveler arrived. This one said nothing, did not stop, but a small bundle fell from his cart, a length of dark wool, damp, and crawling with fleas. A child picked it up. 3 nights later, the fever came. Still, no one spoke of it as omen. Children often grew ill. The world was filled with aches and chills and coughs. It was part of the rhythm, the hum of daily life. But then the silence began. First at the well, where once buckets clattered and women sang, there was only the slow drip, drip, drip. Then the market grew quiet. Then the church, even the wind, which once danced through the eaves, now passed like a breath held too long. Travelers told strange tales of cities shuttered, ports closed, and priests who no longer gave mass. Just stories, said the old men by the fire, but they spoke softer than before. The blacksmith closed an hour early. The shepherd lit his lantern sooner, and still, no one said it aloud. There were crows now, more of them, perched along rooftops in still rows, watching, waiting. The dogs barked into empty corners. The horses refused to drink from the stream, and each morning the fog stayed longer, clinging to fences, to windows, to thoughts. One evening the chapel bell rang 3 times, and then fell silent. No one had touched it, and no one dared ask who had. Children dreamed of black ships. Men dreamed of coughing strangers. Women dreamed of cold hands at their doors. The rhythm was changing. The pulse of life, once so steady, was now uneven. The days felt longer, the nights too quiet, and the fire, though warm, could not chase away the feeling. Not fear exactly, but the sense that the world had paused and listened, as if something far away had turned its gaze and was beginning to walk slowly this way, and you, still resting, can feel the shift. You can hear the hush settling over the land. You are safe, distant, only listening, only drifting, back to a time when the world waited, when no one knew but everyone felt. And as your thoughts grow softer, as your breath deepens once again, you remain still, a silent witness to the first whispers. The mornings arrived pale and uncertain. Once bright and golden, they now crept in with gray veils drawn low, soft light bending through the mist, like a world unsure of its own awakening. Crows moved in crooked spirals overhead, their shadows flickering across shuttered homes. They did not cry out. They only circled and circled and watched. In the village square, the fountain had stopped flowing. No stone was cracked. No branch had fallen in, and yet the water no longer sang. People still moved through their days, but with quieter steps. The laughter of the children had grown fainter, as though swallowed by the thickening air. It was the kind of silence that settles not just over the land, but inside the bones. A quiet that weighs, that lingers, that listens back. They tried to carry on. They swept their stoops, fed their hens, lit their lamps at dusk, but they no longer lingered in the streets, no longer touched hands as they once did. The threads that tied them together were loosening one by one, and then came the masks, strange bird-like things, beaked and somber, worn by men from the cities, physicians, or so they claimed, with eyes hidden behind glass. They did not speak much. They moved with stiff precision, examining doors, windows, and bodies, marking homes with chalk, black for caution, red for loss. Children stared from behind curtains. Mothers pressed fingers to lips, and all watched as the doctors vanished down the road. As silently as they had arrived, a hush spread across the hills. Even the church bell, so long the heartbeat of the town, was still. The priest had taken ill. His doors remained closed, and the candles inside had all burned down, one by one. Families began to disappear. First old Bram the tanner, then the sisters who sold herbs, then the boy who used to chase the geese. No one spoke their names anymore, not because they weren't remembered, but because remembering hurt. The birds called less often now. The woods, once alive with insects and song, grew quiet. Even the stream, which once gurgled with joy, now moved in a slow, unhurried murmur. It was as if the land itself had drawn a breath in and could not let it go. Travelers stopped arriving. No wagons, no tradesmen, no letters, only stillness and dreams, so many dreams. Dreams of dark cloaks, of locked doors, of fields overgrown. The people began to speak less, and when they did, they spoke of simpler things. Bread, firewood, rain, but always with a glance over the shoulder, always with a pause before finishing their thought. Because the air carried more than wind now. It carried memory and rumor and something unnamed. And as you lie there, now quiet and calm, you can feel that world just beyond the veil of sleep, a world moving slower, softer, wrapped in the fog of not knowing. You are not there. You are safe, but still, you see the flickers of candlelight in shuttered windows. You hear the wind in hollow chimneys. You feel the hush that only comes before the storm. Let it pass over you gently. Let it fade as the dreams drift by, because the whispers are growing louder and night is drawing closer, but you are already halfway to sleep, and the silence is kind. The fields once golden with wheat now lay bare, windswept and gray, not barren by drought nor by flood, but by absence. No hands remained to tend them, no feet to walk the furrows, just the wind and the hush it carried. Where once there were songs, farmers humming with the rising sun, women laughing while hanging linens, there was only the creak of boards, the soft sigh of a world slowly forgetting itself. And yet, within every home that remained, a candle still burned, faint but present, as if some quiet part of each soul refused to surrender to the silence. Inside one such cottage, an old woman stirred her pot of herbs. She said nothing, but her hands knew stories. They moved with memory of mothers and grandmothers, of wars and winters, of plagues long past. She burned rosemary at the window, lavender at the door, not because she thought it would stop death, but because it reminded her of life. In the next valley, A shepherd walked with fewer sheep than before. Their bells still chimed, though softer now. He did not sing to them anymore, but he still walked, still led, still believed the meadow might bloom again. There were those who stayed, and those who left, and always those who simply vanished. Doors swung on broken hinges, letters remained unread, chairs at the hearth sat cold, but somehow even this, even the emptiness, had become familiar, and familiarity brought not comfort, but quiet, a stillness that settled deep. The sky was often overcast, but the rain did not fall. The clouds just hung there, weightless and heavy, like grief without tears. Each evening the air grew cooler, and people began to sleep more, not out of rest, but to escape the waking hours. Dreams became longer, stranger, full of doors that never opened, and footsteps that never reached their end. And sometimes, only sometimes, a bell would ring, far off, faint, a single note suspended in time. It meant someone was gone, or perhaps someone had survived. No one could say for sure, but the sound always brought stillness, a pause in breath, a hand to the chest, a prayer unspoken. You feel it now, don't you? That strange calm, that delicate quiet that holds everything in place, like dust resting on an untouched shelf. The world, even in its sorrow, has grown gentle, not out of mercy, but from exhaustion. And as you listen, your own breath begins to match the rhythm of that time. Slow, even, deep, because you are not in that century, and yet you walk its shadows tonight, not as a victim, not as a villager, but as a drifting witness passing silently through the folds of history. Let it carry you. Let it dim the edges of your thoughts. Let the silence soften you. There is one more chapter in this night, one more flicker of candlelight, and by the time it fades, you may already be asleep. A small boy stood at the edge of the village, not much older than 10, eyes wide, bare feet pressing into the cool dirt of a path, once busy with carts and laughter. Now it was still. He held a wooden toy, a knight with a chipped sword. It had belonged to his brother who no longer woke. The boy did not cry. He simply watched as the clouds shifted, as the wind moved through the tall grass, as the sky slowly faded into that peculiar blue-gray that only exists when the sun has disappeared, but night has not yet begun. Somewhere far behind him, an elder struck flint to kindling. A small fire bloomed, and in that flicker a story was told, not aloud, not in words, but in the way her hands moved, in the way she closed her eyes between breaths, in the way her silence seemed to hold entire lifetimes. Across the land, the same scene repeated itself, a repetition not born from habit, but from need. People still lived, still waited, still hoped. In the corner of one crumbling chapel, a priest whispered a prayer not found in any scripture. It was made up on the spot, stitched from memory and desperation. "Keep the living warm," he murmured, "and the dead at peace." No one was there to hear him, but perhaps, somewhere beyond the fog, the earth listened. The rats grew bolder in the cities, the cats thinner, the walls darker, but still candles were lit. Still bread was baked, even if only for one. Still a mother sang to her child, voice trembling, but holding the melody. The world had not ended, only changed, and in that change, a strange sort of quiet beauty began to bloom. Not the beauty of celebration, but of survival, of tenderness in the face of despair, of reaching out, even when no one might reach back. And you, still drifting here, you feel it too. The hush, the weightless sorrow, the gentle, aching calm. You walk through this past not with fear, but with understanding, with grace, because the people of that time, those who endured the first whispers of the plague, did not do so with strength alone. They endured with softness, with stillness, with the quiet refusal to vanish completely, like a candle in a window, burning for someone who may never return, but burning nonetheless. And now, as this chapter closes, as the air grows still around you, you may find that your eyes are heavier, your thoughts quieter, your breath deeper, because this journey, though made in silence, has held your hand gently the whole way. And soon the next chapter will begin, just as this one fades like the last light of dusk. But for now, rest in this moment, float in its hush, sink deeper and deeper still. You are safe, you're warm. You were not born in the time of the plague, and tonight, you are only passing through its memory on your way to sleep. The morning came without a song. No birds stirred in the trees. No footsteps echoed across the stones. The village lay beneath a pale and muted sky, and the only sound was the wind, soft, dry, and uncertain, brushing the corners of shuttered homes. Where once there had been the clang of iron, the ring of laughter, the lowing of oxen, and the bleating of goats. Now there was only the silence, and the silence was a kind of weight, heavy, lingering, almost alive. The church bell, which had tolled each morning at first light for prayers and for peace, hung crooked in its tower. Its rope, frayed and damp with morning dew, swayed gently in the breeze, but made no sound. And though the villagers once gathered beneath its call, like petals toward the warmth of the sun, there was no gathering today. There was only absence, a hollow space where voices used to be. In one home, a narrow timber-built cottage at the end of a winding lane, a fire had gone cold in the hearth. The ashes had settled like dust over the stones, and yet beside the fire sat a wooden cradle, empty, rocking gently, though no hand had touched it. The lullaby was missing, but the memory of song hung there like breath in the air. Outside, the wells stood sealed, covered by heavy lids and nailed planks. Once the heart of daily life, where neighbors met and voices mingled with laughter, the wells now sat still, shut tight against the unknown. No one fetched water, no one risked the depth, and along the narrow path that led beyond the mill and over the crooked bridge, an old oak tree reached long fingers toward the gray sky. Its leaves had darkened, not from autumn, not from time, but from something else, something in the wind, something in the roots. A boy had once climbed that tree. He had carved a name into its bark. The letters were small, uneven, but they still remained. The name of someone gone, someone beloved. The blacksmith's forge, so often the furnace of light and strength, was now dark. The embers had long since died, and the anvil wore a coat of dust. A hammer lay abandoned on the floor, its handle curved with wear, its head streaked faintly with crimson rust. It would not ring out again. Not today, perhaps not ever. The plague did not always scream. Sometimes it whispered. It crept in quiet like ivy over stone, unnoticed, unfelt, until everything had changed. It did not come with fire. It came with stillness. It stole the sound from the world and replaced it with waiting. In the distance, crows circled above the orchard, not in warning, but in watchfulness. They moved as if remembering something that had not yet occurred. Their wings sliced through the air, like writing across the page of the sky, ominous, but also beautiful in their rhythm, predictable in their return. A woman stood beneath them, hooded and still, a basket of lavender clutched to her side. Her face was turned downward, hidden in shadow, but her posture spoke of weariness and of endurance. She did not move when the crows passed overhead. She did not look up. She simply waited, as though time itself had grown too heavy to carry. And in the village square, a single candle burned atop a stone pedestal. It had been lit by unknown hands, and though the wind tugged at its flame, it did not go out. Its light flickered, not in fear, but in memory, for those who had gone, and for those who might yet remain. This was how the days hollowed out, not with violence, but with absence, with silence in place of song, and shadow in place of form, with paths left untrodden and names left unspoken. The bell in the tower still swayed gently in the wind, but it did not ring. Not anymore. Not all had left. Not all had fallen. Some remained. They walked through the village like shadows beneath cloaks, not hurried, not loud, but slowly like ghosts still tethered to the memory of living. Their movements were not driven by hope nor fear, but by a quiet duty that had no name, the duty to stay. Among them was the midwife, an old woman with a spine bent like a question mark, her eyes clouded but unblinking. She did not speak often, but her hands still worked. She tended wounds with herbs gathered in silence, wrapped fevered foreheads with damp cloths, and placed rosemary beneath pillows when there was nothing else left to give. Each morning she passed through the village with a basket woven of thorns and string. Inside it, glass bottles rattled faintly, each filled with tinctures made from root and leaf, none of them cured. But they comforted, and comfort in those days was a kind of miracle. A boy followed her sometimes, barefoot and silent, his eyes wide and hollow. He had no name anyone remembered. He had simply appeared one morning at the edge of the forest, clutching a doll made of twine and buttons. He never spoke, but he watched. He saw everything. The baker remained too, though flour was scarce and the ovens cold. He came each day to knead imaginary dough upon the warm table. His hands, once strong and sure, now moved through empty air. But he smiled as he did it. Perhaps he was remembering a time when the scent of warm bread was the first promise of morning. Or perhaps he had simply forgotten how not to be what he was. In a small cottage where ivy crept over stone, an elderly couple still lit a lantern each night. They placed it in their window, as they had always done, though no travelers passed by anymore. The light was not for others. It was for themselves, a ritual of habit, a stubborn defiance against the encroaching dark. And on the edge of the village, beneath the broken sign that once read "Welcome," sat the black dog. No collar, no master. Its fur was thick with mud, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dusk. It did not bark, it simply waited. Some believed it was an omen, others a protector, but none dared chase it away. It had become part of the landscape, like the crumbling fences, the silent wells, the fields gone wild with thistle and thorn. The ones who stayed did not speak of escape. They no longer measured time in hours, but in small things, a sunrise seen through mist, the sound of a cartwheel turning in the distance, the bloom of a single violet in the cracks between stones. And though the silence pressed in from all sides, it was within that silence that they rediscovered something ancient, a rhythm, a reverence, a way of being still and listening to the world breathe. One morning, a woman with a silver braid down her back stood at the river's edge. She held a small mirror in her hand and tilted it toward the water. In the reflection, there were ripples, but not from wind or stone, from something deeper, something watching. She smiled at it as though recognizing an old friend, then turned away. That day the crows did not circle, the wind did not howl, and for a brief moment, sunlight slipped through the clouds and landed on the thatched roofs like a blessing. The ones who stayed did not expect joy, but neither did they run from sorrow. They simply lived alongside it, as one might live beside a river, never certain when it might flood, but always certain it would flow. Time no longer ticked. It pulsed, soft and slow, like the hush between heartbeats. There were no clocks that still rang, no church bells tolling the hour, only the slow fade of morning light and the long sigh of dusk. People rose when the sky turned pale and slept when the shadows thickened. The day was measured by birdsong and chimney smoke, by the drifting of clouds and the weight of silence. The ones who stayed moved with the rhythm of the earth, their footsteps light, as if unwilling to disturb the bones beneath the soil. No one spoke of what was lost. The names had become too heavy to carry. Instead, they moved around absence, like one steps around a broken stair. knowing it is there, acknowledging it with each quiet glance, but never placing weight upon it. Inside a crumbling barn, a young woman strung garlands of dried lavender across the rafters. She wove the stems carefully, her fingers slow and certain. The scent lingered in the air, soft, sharp, sorrowful. She did not do it for beauty. She did not do it for comfort. She did it because her hands remembered. There was peace in the motion, a stillness that folded itself into her ribs, like breath made visible. In the far corner of the village square, an old man painted with crushed berries and ash. No one asked what he was painting. He did not say, but on every wall, every door, there bloomed spirals and runes, stars and circles, eyes that stared without lids, hands reaching upward. Some believed it was prayer. Others said it was madness, but no one stopped him. No one judged. For in those days, expression was the only defiance that remained. And madness, perhaps, was simply another form of remembering. Even the wind had changed. It no longer howled through the trees, but whispered low, as if it, too, had learned to breathe quietly. It rustled the grass in soft circles, lifted curls of smoke from the chimneys, and carried the scent of damp stone. An old rain, the earth felt sacred, not in a holy sense, but in a way that came from being touched by so much death, so much survival. It was hallowed through hardship, an altar built not of gold, but of broken doors, forgotten toys, and handprints left in drying clay. Each night the villagers lit candles, not all in the same place, but scattered. One in a windowsill, another tucked in the hollow of a tree, a dozen floating on the river, drifting slowly downstream like fallen stars. They did not gather in groups. They did not pray aloud, but they were together, each small flame a whisper in the dark, a quiet acknowledgement that they still were, still here, still breathing, still human. And in that quiet, the village began to shift, not toward joy, not toward once was, but toward something else, a gentleness that grew from shared silence, a unity found not in words, but in the rituals of the ordinary, feeding the chickens, sweeping the steps, baking bread that would not rise, touching the shoulder of someone who did not speak. Love, it seemed, had not died. It had simply grown quieter. Not the kind of love that sings and shouts, but the kind that waits, endures, tends to wounds without needing thanks. This was the rhythm, now the heartbeat between heartbeats. And in that rhythm, the village endured, not out of hope, not out of will, but simply because it could. The village had no map now, no clear path, no plan, just footsteps in the dust, worn tracks between doorways, and the heavy silence of houses that no longer waited. And yet, life persisted in small, curious ways. A child left a stack of pebbles outside every door that still breathed. 6 stones for the living, one for every day of the week but the 7th, the day of rest, the day of remembrance. On that day he placed a feather instead, white, soft, silent. He never said why. no one asked. But each feather was left untouched. Even the wind showed reverence. On the outskirts of the village, a garden had begun to grow again. Not from seeds planted, but from roots forgotten. Wild mint tangled with thistle. Poppies bloomed beside cabbages, and a stubborn row of leeks pushed through the cracked earth like green prayers. There was no fence, no one claimed it, yet hands came day after day to water it, tend it, gather from it, not to own, but to care. And in that quiet tending, something sacred stirred. In a cottage with half a roof, a woman played a single-stringed instrument, its sound barely more than a hum, a vibration against the bones of the air. She did not sing. Her voice had long since fallen silent, but her music, it lingered in the evenings, rising like mist from the fields, settling between stones and cracked windowsills. Some nights, those who remained would stop what they were doing. They would close their eyes and simply listen to the notes, to the wind, to the distant cry of a raven, to the sound of their own breath. It was in these moments that time seemed to fold in on itself, past and present, woven together like thread through linen. They remembered stories told before the sickness, and stories told during it, and even stories yet to come, those that would live on in whispers, long after they too had turned to ash. What remained in the silence was not fear, that had long since burned out. What remained was something older, something heavier, something like reverence, not for the plague, not for death, but for the resilience of the soul, for the beauty in survival, and for the small acts of kindness that did not ask for witness. A scarf left on a doorstep, a bowl of broth still warm, a lullaby hummed without words to a child who would not sleep. The world was changed. It would not go back. The door had closed, but somewhere beyond that door, new roots were forming, not in grand palaces or king's halls, but in kitchens and gardens, and the eyes of those who still looked up to find the stars. For even in grief, even in ruin, something had been born, a quiet strength, a knowing, a deep, unshakable understanding that nothing was promised, but still we remain, still breathing, still reaching, still loving in silence. And that was enough. There came a day when the smoke stopped rising, when the scent of ash gave way to the earthy musk of moss, of bark, of old rain on dry stones. No one marked the moment. There were no bells, no words spoken, only a shared quiet glance between those who remained, and then a decision not made, but simply understood. It was time to walk. The village had cradled them like a cocoon of grief, a place to mourn, to bury, to breathe again. But now the air felt wider, heavier with distance, and somewhere beyond the hills, there might be others, others who remembered, others who forgot, others who never knew. So they gathered what little they had, a satchel of dried roots, a flask of boiled rainwater, a piece of charcoal for marking trees. They did not dress for travel, There were no cloaks left, no boots uncracked, but their feet knew the earth, and the road was quiet. The first steps were always the hardest. Each stride tugged at the invisible threads, still tied to hearthstones, to grave markers, to the quiet places where laughter once rested like morning dew. But the farther they walked, the more those threads stretched, not broken, just loosened. They moved through meadows, overgrown and humming with flies, past wells gone dry, their buckets rotted through woods so silent that even the birds had forgotten their songs. The wind had grown stranger, it carried no messages, only the sound of leaves rustling like whispers, in a language that once was known. One among them, an old man with a bent spine and eyes like worn river stones, spoke little but listened always. He paused often beside trees, laying a hand against their bark, as if hearing something. When asked what he felt, he would only say, "The trees remember more than we do," and on they walked, sometimes in single file, sometimes hand in hand, sometimes drifting apart, then slowly back together again, as if held by something unseen, something gentler than command, but firmer than choice. At night, they slept in hollows, in caves, in crumbling chapels where moonlight slid through cracks like silver threads sewn into stone. They did not speak of dreams. Dreams had become unreliable things, half memory, half invention, woven with the faces of those they could no longer picture clearly. But in waking, there was still comfort, the sound of footfalls, the shape of another figure ahead, the way firelight flickered on the curved cheek of a friend whose name still warmed the mouth. This was not pilgrimage, nor exile, nor even survival. It was simply the next thing, to walk, to see, to know what else the world had become, to move forward not because of hope, nor in spite of fear, but because there was still road, still earth, still breath. They came upon it in the haze of twilight, a chapel, ancient and warm, half sunk into the earth like a shipwrecked prayer, its steeple bent, its doors long unhinged, its stone walls veined with ivy, as if nature herself had tried to hold it together. They stepped inside without words. Dust hung in the air, spinning slowly in a shaft of violet light that slanted through the broken windows. The silence inside was not emptiness. It was memory. Long wooden pews lay tilted, some cracked clean through, others still upright, as though waiting for worshippers who had simply stepped out and never returned. In the corner, a rusted candelabra still clung to the wall. Its melted wax had pooled into strange, silent forms like frozen ghosts bowed in eternal prayer. The travelers did not kneel, they did not whisper, but they lingered. A woman placed her hand on the altar, gently, as if laying it on the forehead of a sleeping child. Her breath slowed, her shoulders lowered, not in reverence, but in recognition. She remembered a different chapel long ago, a wedding, a funeral, a lullaby echoing through stone arches while someone, a brother, a mother, a friend, lit candles in the dusk. Now this place held only echoes, yet it felt less lonely than the road. Not safer, but known. They made camp in the nave. Blankets laid upon cracked tiles, soup warmed over a fire, built inside the empty font. No one spoke of the sacred. No one needed to. Outside, the wind picked up. It moved through the trees like breath, tugging gently at the crumbling stones. As if asking them to let go, one man climbed the steps to what remained of the choir loft. He stood there, alone, looking out through the shattered rose window at the violet horizon. The sun had bled into dusk, the sky a canvas of ash and wine. He whispered a song, or maybe only hummed. The tune was not joyful, nor sorrowful. It was simply old. One of the children, a girl with hair like dandelion seed, climbed up to join him. She did not speak. She only leaned beside him, resting her head against a wooden rail, watching the clouds move like forgotten ships, drifting across an unseen sea. Down below, someone wept, quietly, not from pain, but from memory, the kind that arrives not with sharpness, but with warmth, the kind that says, you were here, and so was I, and we were human once. That night, the chapel breathed with them. The walls held their sighs. The roof cradled their sleep. No stars were visible. The sky was thick with mist, but it did not matter. They had found shelter, not from the world, but within it. And for one night, the road could wait. At dawn, the sky wore its sorrow in violet hues. Not the bright promise of morning, but the quiet ache of persistence. A gentle murmur of wind stirred the trees, whispering through hollow boughs like monks in prayer. The travelers rose, not fully rested, but quieter somehow, as if the night inside the crumbled chapel had peeled something heavy from their shoulders. They moved again, no rush, no destination marked on any map, only the rhythm of walking, and the instinct to stay ahead of the silence that sometimes followed too close behind. By midday, they found it. Another village, abandoned, yet not empty. The kind of place where shadows still remembered how to walk in the shapes of those long gone. The buildings leaned inward like old people whispering secrets. Wells were dry, windows broken, and in the center, a great bell tower stood crooked against the ash-blown sky. Its spire pierced the clouds like a forgotten sword. Once it had called people together for worship, for warning, for weddings and goodbyes. Now it was silent, and yet somehow louder in its silence than anything else around it. A child approached the base of the tower. She looked up, eyes wide with wonder, or fear, or both. She asked if the bell still worked. No one answered, but one of the men, an older one limping with sorrow behind his eyes, stepped forward. He touched the rope that dangled, threadbare and stiff, frayed by wind and time. He gave it a gentle tug. Nothing. He pulled harder. The bell groaned, a low, ancient sound, like a beast long asleep. Then it rang, not loud, not clear but real. The tone wavered through the dusty air, like a memory waking up. The villagers, what few of them remained, peeked from doorways. Birds took flight, children froze, and for a moment, time curled in on itself. It was as if the bell called not just to the living, but to the past, to every soul who had ever stood in that square, to those who were born here, those who loved here, those who had fallen and been buried beneath these very stones. The man let go of the rope. The bell swayed, then settled. Silence returned, but something had shifted. A girl pressed her hand against the tower's cool stone. A boy left a piece of bread beside the threshold, as if offering it to a ghost. They did not linger, but they did not run. As they walked away, no one spoke, yet every step felt heavier, as though they carried something invisible, some piece of the past that refused to be forgotten. The bell never rang again, but its sound lingered in the marrow of their bones, not as music, but as memory. Evening came as a sigh across the land, not sudden, but like a curtain slowly drawn by the unseen hands of time. The path they walked bent low between hills now cloaked in shadow, and the trees whispered again, not warnings, but remembrance. Their footsteps were fewer now. Some had stayed behind, too weary, too broken, or simply unwilling to follow silence any farther. Still, those who moved forward did so with a strange peace, as if each step now carried the hush of understanding. Not answers, but acceptance. They passed through a vale where the air smelled of damp stone, and the ground beneath them was soft with old leaves. The world seemed paused, held in a breath, waiting. It was here, in this forgotten fold of the land, that they saw the lantern. It flickered alone, beside what had once been a cottage, half swallowed by ivy. Its roof caved, its windows yawning wide like tired eyes too heavy to stay open. Yet the lantern burned, not brightly, not boldly, but steadily, as if it had never been extinguished, only forgotten. One of the travelers, a young man with threadbare gloves, approached it with caution. He did not touch it. He simply sat beside it and watched it glow, like a memory that refused to fade. Another joined him, then another, until they all sat, ringed around this gentle flame, like moths drawn not by heat, but by the idea that something could still endure. No one asked who lit it. No one questioned how it still burned. After so much time, some things they had learned were not meant to be explained. The light shimmered across their tired faces, illuminating none fully, casting all in soft halos of violet and smoke. And in that hush, that sacred quiet between night and breath, someone began to hum, a tune with no name, a melody made not of notes, but of ache and dust and hope. Others joined until the valley itself seemed to hum with them. The trees, the wind, the earth. It was not a song. It was a release. Grief loosened its grip. Fear softened. And for the first time in many nights, someone laughed. Not loudly, not joyfully, but with the brittle lightness of remembering how. The lantern danced, and when they rose to leave, none dared take it. They left it burning for the next traveler, for the next night. As they disappeared beyond the bend, the light held its place, like a heartbeat, like a promise, that not all things would be swallowed by the dark. The road did not end. It curved endlessly, through valleys that once heard laughter, through woods that once knew the footsteps of children, but now only quiet, only wind brushing empty branches like a mother searching for a cradle long since taken. They came upon a village at dawn, or what had once been one. There were no guards at the gate, no smoke curling from chimneys, no dogs barking, no birds singing, just stillness, so perfect, so complete. It made their breath feel loud. The houses stood in neat lines, leaning slightly, as if tired of waiting for someone to return. Their shutters hung ajar, like half-closed eyes that had wept too long. Doors creaked gently in the wind, but nothing stirred within. They stepped carefully between the buildings, boots brushing over frost-laced earth. Every sound echoed. A stone kicked, a cloak rustled, the whisper of wind through hollow doorways. In the square, a well sat covered, its rope curled like a sleeping serpent. Beside it, a child's toy cart, unbroken, unclaimed. Time, it seemed, had stopped in mid-step. They peered into windows, not out of curiosity, but reverence. And within each home lay small stories, a cup left half filled, a spoon resting on a table, a loaf of bread grown hard in the silence. No bodies, no signs of struggle, only the aching absence of presence. The young woman in the red shawl found a book still opened by a hearth, its pages yellowed, its words unread. She did not take it. She simply touched its corner and whispered a prayer for the hands that once turned its pages. Farther down, an old man knelt at a threshold, not to enter, but to listen. He pressed his ear to the wood as if hoping for the echo of a forgotten lullaby, a child's laugh, or the scrape of a chair. But the house said nothing, and he wept not for the dead, but for the quiet. One of them lit a candle, left it at the well. Another hung a ribbon on the door, a gentle blue, a color of waiting. No one said the village was haunted. It wasn't. It was held, preserved, like a dream the world wasn't ready to wake from. As they left, they did not speak. The silence had entered them, had become part of their breath, their stride, their memory. And though they walked onward, they carried that village with them. Each shutter, each empty chair, each invisible goodbye, like relics woven into the thread of their slow, eternal pilgrimage. By twilight, they reached the edge of a forest veiled in mist. The trees bent low, their trunks wide like watchful elders. Guarding secrets, the wind no longer spoke aloud. Just beyond, nestled between the roots of an ancient elm, stood a chapel, not grand, but old and quietly breathing. Its stones were warm with memory, even in the fading light. A bell, long silent, hung above its arched door, wrapped in vines of ivy and thyme. Inside, the air smelled of wax and wood. 1,000 candles had once burned here, perhaps for weddings, for prayers, for burials, for no reason at all, just to keep the dark at bay. And still some candles remained. She appeared as if from shadow. An old woman, small, stooped, her robe the color of fog. At the end of winter, she did not speak at first. She only watched them, eyes like wells, deep and dark, but kind. Then she turned, wordless, and beckoned. They followed her through the narrow nave, past pews worn smooth by centuries of knees, into a quiet alcove, where hundreds of candles still stood, unlit, unburned, waiting. She moved slowly, hands trembling not with fear, but with memory, with reverence. One by one she lit the candles, not quickly, but lovingly, as if each flame was a name, a face, a farewell. They watched in silence as the alcove began to glow. The flames danced, not brightly, but softly, as if remembering old lullabies or letters never sent. Finally she spoke. She said the candles were not hers. They belonged to those who could not return, each one a soul remembered, a story untold, a breath held in stillness. She said she had not left the chapel since the bells last rang, not out of fear, but promise. She had vowed to keep the light burning for those who wandered, not the living, not the dead, but the in-between. She was the keeper of candles, a guardian of glow, in a world grown dark. And as they sat near her, basking in the hush of flickering light, they felt no need to speak, no need to ask why she remained. The warmth was enough, the glow was enough. And in that quiet moment, the chapel became more than stone. It became memory and mercy and a kind of peace they hadn't known in a long, long time. When they left, the candles stayed behind, still burning, still whispering. And though her name was never told, they would remember her always as the one who kept the light, not for herself, but for all who had no place to return. They walked until their legs no longer felt like their own, until the wind no longer whispered, but simply hummed, a quiet lull beneath the fading sky. Ahead, they saw rooftops slouching under the weight of silence. A village, or what once had been. No birds flew over it, no dogs barked, no smoke rose from chimneys, and the well at the center of the square stood like a monument to absence. Everything was left as if time had paused, as if someone had whispered, "Wait here," and the village had obeyed. Doors remained slightly ajar, chairs half turned, as though the occupant had just stepped away. Plates on tables, cups on windowsills, shoes near thresholds still paired, as if waiting for their owners to return. But no footsteps followed. The air smelled of dust, not decay, as though nature had respectfully left it untouched. They walked the narrow lanes with soft steps, like visitors in a dream. Every window they passed reflected the gray of the sky, and the faint shimmer of the past. They entered one house, the door creaking not in fear, but in remembrance. Inside, time had folded in on itself. A child's toy sat beside a faded rug. A wooden spoon rested in a bowl, still holding the last grain of rice. And above the hearth, a painting. A woman, her face delicate, partially peeled away by the years, eyes blurred, smile forgotten, but the frame remained straight. Someone once had cared enough to keep it level. In the next home, a book remained open, its pages browned and curling, the ink faded but still legible in places. A poem, maybe, or a prayer. They did not read it aloud. Some words are best left between pages and ghosts. Even the animals had not returned. No birds in the rafters, no mice in the corners, as if the world had agreed. This place was not to be disturbed. They found a chapel, smaller than the one before. It had no roof now, just vines and the soft light of dusk, falling through the exposed beams like a benediction. At the altar lay a single rose, wilted, colorless, but somehow whole, and in the pews they sat for a while, not to pray, not to speak, but to listen. To what? They weren't sure. The silence here was different, not empty, not cruel, just still, as though the village itself was sleeping, dreaming. And if they listened long enough, they could almost hear the laughter that once danced through the streets, the markets, the music, the bells, all of it echoing gently in memory. When they stood again, they did not look back. There are places the past asks us to leave, as we found them, untouched, unspoken, sacred. And so they left the ruined village to its rest, its quiet, its dignity, a time capsule sealed not with locks, but with love. As the sun dimmed further behind the clouds, casting the hills in long lavender hues, they reached a ridge where the land once held a village, but now held only memory. There were no homes, no wells, no fences or farms, only stones, some laid flat, some broken, some standing crooked in the wind, grave markers, dozens, hundreds, some named, some nameless. Here, a family lay together, etched carefully in Latin. There, a simple wooden cross, weathered down to a splintered stump, and in between, the earth, soft with time, quiet with acceptance. They stepped lightly, their breaths slow, their movements reverent, as if the very soil had something sacred to say. It was not sorrow that filled the air, but something else, something deeper, the hush of understanding, the lull of eternity. A single iron bell stood at the far end, hanging from a leaning frame of timber. It had not rung in decades, and yet it watched, patient and proud. They paused before it, looked up into the hollow beneath its crown. The wind stirred, and for a moment it seemed to hum, not a chime, not a sound, but a presence. It had seen the ending. It had waited through silence. It had outlived the voices, the tears, the years. And now it stood for all of them, the forgotten and the remembered, the mourned and the misunderstood, the ones who had wandered and the ones who had stayed. They sat beneath it, letting their backs rest against the damp stone wall, letting their minds drift like leaves on the wind. The air grew colder, and mist curled through the trees, but it wasn't frightening. It felt like a blanket, a veil, a gesture. They thought of the people who had once walked here, whose footsteps were now lost beneath the moss, of the lives lived in joy and in fear, in faith and in doubt. They thought of children who never grew old, of elders who watched the world end from a window, of healers with empty hands, of prayers whispered until the final breath, all of it now held in the stillness. And as the final breath of dusk exhaled over the valley, they closed their eyes, not to sleep, not to dream, but to remember, quietly, gently. The last bell did not ring. It didn't need to. Its silence said enough. They walked again, not with urgency nor with purpose, but with a rhythm that only silence teaches. The path had narrowed, no longer a road, not quite a trail, but something in between. A hollow pressed into the land by centuries of forgotten footsteps. Branches arched overhead, gnarled and dark, woven like cathedral rafters, leafless, skeletal, yet elegant in their emptiness. The air was thick with a scent of old bark, of time-soaked stone, of soil that had absorbed sorrow. For too many winters to name, dust curled around their boots. It rose gently with every step, like memory disturbed, like ghosts remembering how to breathe. They passed no milestones, no markers, no sign of man or map. But the land spoke in other ways, a rusted scythe, half buried in moss, a collapsed boundary wall, its stones worn smooth by rain, a doll's porcelain hand peeking from the earth, fingers cracked as if reaching for the child who lost it long ago. They did not speak. Words felt too heavy, too modern, too loud. So they listened to the wind sifting through branches, to the subtle creak of the forest's breath, to the hush of dust settling. As if whispering, we remember. The plague had come through here, too. It had not spared this valley, though time had tried to smooth its scars. But the hollow remembered. It always did. The shape of absence clung to the earth like a shadow, not frightening, not cruel, just present. Like the curve left behind when something precious is taken. They stepped over the remnants of a gate, its posts still anchored, its iron hinges long rusted away. On the other side, a field, overgrown, but once tilled with hope. You could almost hear it if you stood still enough. The echo of laughter, the song of a farmer's whistle, the soft clang of pail to stone, all of it gone, but not forgotten. The land itself mourned slowly, not with weeping, but with waiting, waiting for feet to return, for someone to walk the hollowed roads again, to notice the quiet, to honor the stillness. And so they walked, each footstep a hymn, each breath a prayer for the ones who had no one left to remember their names, there came a curve in the path, and beyond it, nestled low in a quiet bowl of earth, lay the village, or what remained of it. Fog clung to its rooftops like old breath refusing to leave. Thin, silver-veined strands wrapped chimneys and beams, casting the broken walls in a ghostly sheen. The sky above was pale, not quite day, not quite night, as though the heavens themselves were unsure whether to open or close. The village was still, but not empty. There was a presence in its silence, not of movement, but of memory. A fence leaned sideways along a garden where lavender had once grown. Its brittle stalks, long dead, swayed gently in the breeze, as if remembering the scent of summer long after summer had forgotten them. Windows stared out like eyes. Most had no glass, just arc rectangles where light had once gathered, warm yellow glows, spilling stories onto cobblestone. The doors hung ajar, some gently, some splintered, as if people had left in a hurry or not at all. Beneath one slanted awning, a table remained, set for two, plates turned to bowls by ring, a fork rusted into stillness, and a candle, its wax melted into a pale puddle, as though extinguished mid-sentence. They paused before the well. Its stones were moss-covered, but the rope still dangled, untouched, as though someone had drawn water and simply forgotten to pull it back up. Inside one small home, a chair lay tipped on its side. A book rested beneath it, open to a page, whose words had blurred with time. They stood there, looking in, not to disturb, but to witness, and in the hush the village whispered. It did not scream, it did not beg, it merely offered the echoes of a life once lived. A child's shoe in the corner, a length of ribbon tied to the handle of a trunk, a cracked mirror still reflecting the outline of the room, even though no one stood within it, and above it all that eternal fog, drifting through empty alleys, curling around chimneys, softening the edges of decay until even sorrow became beautiful. They did not cry. Grief here was not loud. It was woven into the wood, pressed into the cobbles, held gently by the vines. This was not a place of terror. It was a place of remembering. And as they moved on, footsteps gentle, the fog shifted slightly, not parting, but acknowledging them, as though the village knew it had been seen, and that, perhaps, was enough. The road beyond the village was narrow, carved between whispering hedgerows and trees so ancient. Their branches curved like old spines. Beneath their canopy, the light faded to violet gray, soft like sleep just before the dream. Here, there were no more signs, no letters, no markings, only the sound of footsteps, pressed into damp earth and the hush of wind as it curled around empty spaces. A crow watched from a high bough, its feathers shadowed dark. Its cry swallowed before it left its beak. Even birds, it seemed, spoke more quietly here. The world had become a whisper. No cart wheels creaked, no market bells rang, no distant voices sang lullabies to the dusk. only the breathing trees, the wind threading gently through branches that held both leaf and memory. One tree had carvings in it, initials, a heart, a date half erased, a vow etched during spring, now softened by rain and time. They paused to touch it, a silent tribute to hands that once believed in forever. Ahead, the path curved beside a low wall, once painted white, now worn to a pale gray. Along its top, a line of stones had been placed, deliberate, careful, not decoration, but remembrance, one for each soul, perhaps, left unnamed but not forgotten. Beyond the wall, a field stretched into the fog, empty. No rows of wheat, no grazing deer, just the quiet hum of a world waiting for something to begin again. They walked slower now, as though each step might disturb the hush. Even the wind stepped lightly, weaving among tall grass, and gathering the scent of old earth and forgotten harvests. They passed an overturned cart, its wheel half buried in the soil. Inside, a single blanket, moth-eaten but carefully folded. Someone had once tried to carry comfort with them, even when the road was dark. Above them, a branch snapped in the breeze, dropping a single leaf that drifted down like the last note of a song. No longer sung, stillness wrapped around them, not cold, but complete, the kind of stillness that holds a world in pause. And in that pause, they listened, not for words, not for music, but for the soft pulse of something enduring. The sound of nothing is never truly empty. It carries the echoes of laughter once lived, of names once spoken, of stories left half finished. It holds everything that once was, and everything that might be again. They did not speak. There was no need. Silence said it all. And the trees, the earth, the sky, they listened too. At the end of the path, where the land folded into low hills, there stood a wooden gate, not grand, not gilded, not guarded, just a door hinged to nothing but a crumbling stone arch. Alone in a field of heather and silence, it stood as if waiting, not for anyone, not for anything specific, but simply waiting, as a candle waits to be lit, as the tide waits to return. The figure walked toward it with steps made slow by thought. Their boots left faint impressions in the soft moss, but even those marks seemed to fade behind them, as though the earth was gently erasing their presence, tucking it away, like a dream being forgotten just after waking. Beyond the door, fog rose like a silver veil. It moved not with wind, but with breath, as though the land itself was breathing in sleep. They paused at the threshold, hand resting on the wooden edge. It was warm, not in temperature, but in feeling, worn by many hands before, each one with its own story, its own sorrow, its own hope. There was a bell hanging beside it, small, rusted, with no clapper to ring, a bell that called without sound. And still, somehow, the invitation could be felt. Behind them, the hollow road wound backward into silence. Ahead, the fog offered nothing but uncertainty. And yet, for the first time, uncertainty felt kind, gentle, like the closing of eyelids after a long, long day. They stepped through the gate. No flash of light, no thunder. No voice from the heavens, just the soft crunch of footfall and the quiet hum of peace. A wooden fence ran along the side of the field, tilting slightly as though leaning in to hear the traveler's thoughts. There were wildflowers pushing through its cracks, lavender, clover, small white blossoms with no name but presence. Far in the distance, a cottage lay nestled beneath a canopy of trees, its chimney long, cold, its shutters closed, but it stood, undefeated, whole. A chair sat on the porch, its cushion faded. A cup still rested beside it, as if someone had only just left, and would be returning any moment now. The figure walked slowly toward it, drawn not by need, but by memory. Something long ago, something buried deep, had whispered of this place, a place where time was thin, where sorrow was silent, and where rest was not earned but offered. They reached the door, but did not knock. Instead, they sat in the chair. It did not creak, did not protest. It welcomed. And for the first time in what felt like forever, they closed their eyes and heard nothing. Not emptiness, but nothing. The beautiful, complete, perfect. Nothing. The wind paused, the world paused, and sleep arrived. Not as a thief, but as a friend. The door remained open, and the fog rolled on. Somewhere beyond that silver veil, the world still turned. But here, in this hollow, in this gentle moment, everything was finally still, and the story, for now, could rest. There was a bridge they spoke of only in whispers. It spanned a river no map named and no road ever marked. It appeared not on command but on need, and only to those who had walked long enough in sorrow to recognize its shape. Through the haze of forgetting, it was said to be made of ash, not the wood of trees, but the remnants of what once stood tall, burned, softened, reborn. The air around it was different, thinner, like breath held in reverence, or perhaps in fear. And so the figure came one quiet evening, with dust on their boots and time heavy on their shoulders. They did not seek the bridge, they simply reached it, as if all roads had led there, without their knowing. The river below did not rush. It did not roar. It moved like silk, unraveling in slow motion, dark, reflective, deep enough to remember everything ever lost. No birds circled here. No wind stirred. The silence was not absence, but fullness, like a church after the choir has gone, where echoes of sacredness still cling to the rafters. The bridge creaked softly as they stepped upon it. Each plank beneath their footfall spoke with an old voice. It did not resist. It did not guide. It simply carried. To cross it was to feel not the span of distance, but the weight of memory. It was not a passage from here to there, but from before to after. The figure paused halfway, looked down, and saw not their reflection, but the face of a loved one lost long ago, eyes closed, peaceful. Another step, and another face. A teacher once kind, a friend once loyal, a stranger once generous. All those who had passed before, rising not from the water, but from the remembrance of it. The figure did not weep. There were no tears left, only breath, slow, measured, grateful. At the far end of the bridge stood a lantern, swaying gently though no wind blew. Its flame was soft, not gold, but violet, not hot, but warm enough to suggest a presence. Beside it, a single stone bore an inscription written in a language no one alive remembered, and yet the meaning was understood in the heart. You have carried enough. The figure placed a hand on the cool surface of the stone, and for a moment their shadow disappeared. There was no urgency to leave the bridge, no call from the far side, only the knowledge that the next step would be lighter than the last. So they stood between two worlds on the quiet bridge of ash and listened to the river whisper its gentle truths. Beyond the ashen bridge lay a village suspended in a moment that never moved forward. The streets were intact, stone paths clean, no rubble or rot, only stillness. No smoke rose from chimneys, no carts rattled across cobblestone, no voices echoed from windows left ajar. Everything had paused, even the breeze, which elsewhere whispered softly through ruined forests and hushed fields, refused to stir here. A sign at the village edge read simply, "We remember," carved into old wood and tied with a ribbon, faded to the color of old bruises. It was not a warning, it was not an invitation, it was a declaration of presence without motion. The houses, stone and timber, stood proud, yet quiet. Each one bore signs that someone had once cared deeply for them. Flowers dried in windowsills, curtains drawn precisely halfway, chairs on porches, angled just so. Inside the clockmaker's shop, 1,000 timepieces stood frozen, tall grandfather clocks with faces of ivory and brass, delicate pocket watches on velvet trays, tiny cuckoos, forever poised to emerge but never quite ready. Every second here had been halted by unseen hands, not broken, not abandoned, just set aside. The figure wandered slowly through the square. Their footsteps made no sound. It was as if the earth beneath chose to muffle even the smallest disruption. At the well, a bucket rested on its lip half full. The water within reflected a lavender sky, unmoving, unbroken. The figure leaned closer and saw not themselves, but a stranger, a child, a baker, a seamstress, a mother. One by one, faces appeared in the water, and though their eyes were shadowed, their presence was not hollow. These were the ones who had stayed when others fled, who had chosen to root themselves in ritual, in silence, and collective memory. They did not live here anymore, not in flesh, but they had not gone either. In the bell tower at the heart of the village, the great bronze bell stood still, no rope, No ringer, only its vast round shape catching the pale violet light, as if waiting for the world to earn the right to sound it again. The figure touched its base. It was warm, perhaps memory, had a temperature. Perhaps stillness was not silence, but sacred pause. And so, with no ceremony, the figure sat on the edge of the fountain, among the unmoving leaves, beneath a sky held in stasis. They listened, and in the quiet, something stirred within them. Not fear, not sadness, just the recognition of something once forgotten, that even in places where time has stopped, grief still breathes gently beneath the surface. The road wound on, beyond the village that had stopped its clocks, past empty fields where the wind had forgotten its name, into a hollow carved not by hands, but by centuries of stillness. There, half hidden beneath the earth, was a door. It was old as bone, and twice as quiet. Built into the slope of the hill, surrounded by moss and root-bound soil. The door was not meant to be found, and yet the figure found it anyway. They stood before it, head bowed, as if waiting for permission from something ancient and unseen. When they placed their palm on the wood, it did not creak or yield. It simply dissolved into shadow. The air beyond the threshold was neither warm nor cold. It was deep, a kind of depth that wrapped around the skin like a velvet memory. The tunnel curved and sloped downward. It smelled of wet stone, of smoke long vanished, of breath trapped in time. On the walls, lanterns hung, but they did not burn with fire. Instead, they glowed softly with a violet hue, like starlight remembered through tears. Each one flickered to life as the figure passed, and with each glow, a name was whispered, not aloud, but in the mind, not heard, but known. Margot, the healer, Edric, the bell ringer, Santa, who sang lullabies to the wind. These were the ones who had been buried here, not in coffins, but in memory. Further in, the passage opened into a great underground chamber. There were no altars, no tombs, only an endless field of candles, uncounted, untouched. Each candle burned with a color between purple and blue, a soft, glowing sorrow that did not mourn, but honored. The figure moved among them slowly, each step deliberate, each breath steady. No names marked the candles, no stones bore dates, and yet every soul remembered here was known. By the silence itself, in the center of the cavern was a pool, still as glass, lit from below by something that pulsed slowly, like a sleeping heartbeat. The figure knelt beside it, not to drink, not to touch, just to be. Their reflection did not match their face. It was older, then younger, then gone. Time did not obey the laws of men or sun. In this place, here, 1,000 years could pass. Between one breath and the next, a single moment could stretch into eternity, if memory willed it. And so the figure remained, not alone, but accompanied by every name spoken only in silence, They did not weep. There were no tears left for the world that was, but they bowed their head in reverence, for this was a sacred tomb, not of bones, but of remembrance. A final lantern flickered to life. At the chamber's edge, it glowed brighter than the rest, casting no shadow, yet illuminating none. And the figure knew their own memory had been added to the eternal archive, not for death, but for witness. Above the hidden chamber, the sky had darkened into a deep, unending dusk, not from clouds nor from storm, but from the quiet turning of the world's breath. Nightfall no longer came. With warning or rhythm, it simply arrived like a sigh. The figure emerged from the earth's gentle mouth, lanterns fading behind them, candles flickering into memory, and the door, that ancient, root-bound door, sealed once more, as if it had never opened. The forest was still, but not empty. Branches twisted like old hands, reaching for a moon that had forgotten how to rise. Beneath them, the path curved, not forward, but inward. Each step the figure took echoed with a hush, a silence so full it felt like song, and then from far away a sound, faint, wavering, as if cast through fog from another age. A bell, one single toll. It did not ring from a tower, nor from a chapel. It rang from the air itself, as though the world remembered what it had lost. The figure paused, eyes closed. Another bell, then another, a cascade of tolls, soft and round, flowing like ripples on a midnight lake. They were not morning bells, they were remembering. Each note was for a name, no longer spoken. Each tone a cradle for a soul carried too early into the unknown. In a clearing up ahead, the figure saw them, others, silhouettes, shapes without detail, faces turned away, or cloaked in shadow, but present, real. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, standing still, hands clasped or folded, each one listening to the tolling bells. Some held candles, some held nothing, some simply stood, bare and quiet. As the trees, this was not a funeral, it was a vigil, a gathering of those who had not forgotten, those who still carried the names of the lost like seeds in their palms. The bells slowed. 3 final chimes, then silence. But the silence had changed. It no longer weighed, it shimmered, and the wind returned, a soft current brushing cheeks, lifting hair. It smelled faintly of herbs, wood smoke, and something else, something holy. One by one, the shadows began to move, not away, but deeper into the forest, into themselves. The figure did not follow. They simply watched as each silhouette dissolved into dusk and mist, leaving only footprints that would be gone by morning. And when the last had faded, the figure turned east. There, a pale horizon hinted at a coming day, not bright, not loud, but soft. A day meant for planting, for remembering, for beginning again, without forgetting. The bells would not toll again, not today, but their echoes, their echoes, would linger in every leaf, every stone, every breath, and the figure, now alone, walked into the hush, with peace in their step. The plague had taken much, but it had not taken memory, and memory, whispered through bells, was the quiet promise that nothing truly vanished so long as someone still listened. There was once a house hidden in a fold of the hills, beyond the fog, beyond the maps where no roads led and no birds sang. You would not find it on any parchment scroll, nor would any traveler mention it by name, but the old paths knew it, and the wind remembered. It was said the house had always been there, since the first frost, since the first plague, since the first sorrow, ever whispered by firelight. It sat alone on a small hill of moss and bone, wrapped in ivy, blanketed by mist, its windows dim, its roof leaning like a tired soul. And inside that crooked house there lived a healer. Not young, not old, neither man nor woman, or perhaps both. The kind of figure the world forgets until it is in need. They did not speak often. Their voice, when heard, was soft as parchment turning. Their eyes, hidden beneath the shadow of a hood, stitched from thistle-colored wool, had seen more than any eyes should see. Fever, fire, flight, and yet kindness too. Gentleness tucked in between tragedy, like pressed flowers between heavy books. People did not come to the house. Not anymore. Once, perhaps, long ago, they had climbed the winding hills through the choking mists, carrying the sick or the dying or the dead. But time had passed. The world had found new remedies, new fears, new distractions. Still the healer remained, tending to herbs that grew without light, crushing petals into powders, with a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the earth, listening to the forest breathe, speaking to spiders as though they were guests. And every evening, without fail, they lit a candle in the window, not for themselves, but for the lost. The house had many rooms, though few had ever seen them. One was lined with jars, each one holding a memory. Another with scrolls, written in languages no longer spoken. But the most sacred room was the smallest, a place of silence, of waiting. In it sat a single chair, a basin of cool water, a blanket folded with care, and a book always left open to the same page. No one remembered who the healer was waiting for, not even the healer, but the room remained ready, just in case. Because in times of plague and pain and forgetting, sometimes hope arrives on the back of stillness. Sometimes healing begins, not with cure, but with quiet. And so the healer waited, not for fame, not for thanks, but for the soft knock on the door that the world had left behind. And far below, in the village, a fever began to rise again, the kind that does not burn the skin, but hollows the soul. A fever of forgetting, of silence, of despair. And in the folds of the fog, a wind began to carry whispers, whispers of a house, beyond the hill, a house of moss, a house of memory, a house where a candle still burned, down in the valley where rooftops clustered like fallen leaves, and chimneys coughed into the dusk. A child stirred in her sleep. Her name was Elira. The fever had come silently, as it always did, not with thunder or shriek, but with a sigh. It crept into the bones, into the breath, into the dreams, and it began to erase things. A father's voice, a mother's lullaby, the color of the sky. Elira tossed and turned in her cot of straw and linen. Outside, her mother wept, praying into hands already trembling from too many nights without answers. The village healer had gone north. The apothecary had closed his doors, and the priest now only offered quiet shrugs and wilted candles. But the old woman across the lane, the one who rarely spoke, who kept a crow as a companion and left offerings of salt on her doorstep, she remembered the house, the candle, the path no one walked anymore. She told the mother softly, carefully, of the last healer. Not in stories of fire and miracle, but in hushed tones, meant to honor things sacred. And so, the next morning before dawn, as the fog pressed against the windows, a small boy was chosen. He was Elira's brother, no more than 9. His name was Orn, and he had the quiet bravery of trees in winter. They dressed him in a thick cloak, placed a kiss upon his brow, and handed him a satchel filled with dried rosehips, a tattered map, and a note folded carefully with hands that trembled. "Give this to the healer," they told him. He did not ask where the healer lived. He did not ask why the candle burned. He only nodded and set out into the morning that was neither light nor dark, but something in between. The path was not marked. The trees whispered in languages. Older than fire, crows flew beside him, silent sentinels with ink-dark wings. The fog was thick enough to make the world feel small. Every step a question, every breath a quiet hope. But Oren did not turn back. He passed the fallen archway, where time had melted stone. He climbed the slippery slope where no birds sang, and at last he saw it. The house. It leaned slightly to the left, as if listening. Ivy curled across its door like green veins, and in the upper window a single candle flickered, steady, unchanged, unafraid. He stood before it, chilled and unsure, his breath visible, his heart loud. Then, as if pulled by the hush of the world, he raised his hand and knocked. Once, twice, a third time. The door opened slowly, not by hand, but by time itself. And there, in the shadows beyond, stood the healer, cloaked in midnight blue, hood drawn low. Their presence felt like dusk, not frightening, but solemn. They did not speak. Oren stepped forward, holding out the note. The healer took it with gloved hands. Their eyes, hidden but bright, rested on the boy for a long, long moment. Then a nod, not of approval nor pity, but of promise. Without a word, the healer turned. The door remained open. Oren stood at the threshold, waiting, unsure, and then he felt it. the faint warmth of the candle's light touching his face. Like a lullaby, he stepped inside. Outside, the fog swirled slowly. Patient, ancient, the house had accepted a guest. The journey had begun. Beneath the ash and ivy, beneath the weight of silence and stone, there lived a whisper of warmth, long hidden, long forgotten. The village no longer remembered her name, only that a woman once lived at the edge of the woods, where the air stayed thick with herbs and the trees leaned in to listen. She had not walked among the others since the first bell tolled. They said she spoke to things unseen, wrapped tinctures in bark, and brewed thoughts into teas. She was neither feared nor welcomed, only watched from afar. Like a flickering candle you never fully trust, but never quite blow out. The forest had grown around her home, like a cathedral made of branches. Its canopy darkened the soil, so even the light arrived slowly. And yet things grew, not with speed, but with certainty. Soft moss curled over her doorstep. Chickens wandered lazily through patches of mint. Inside, shelves sagged under jars, filled with shadows, powders, roots, and dreams. The walls hummed with quiet rituals long past remembering. She heard the plague's arrival, not through screams or sermons, but in the way the birds stopped singing, in the way bees circled slower, as though the sky had thickened, in the way the stream changed its tune, trickling like a throat half closing. And when they came to her, those few who dared, they did not knock, they only waited outside, hoping she would come to the door. And she did. Not always, but sometimes she chose silence, the way others chose words. And when she did open the door, no one ever asked her name. They simply held out their hands, and she filled them with leaves or cloth soaked in silver water, or nothing at all, just a look that made them forget what they feared. Some called her witch, some said saint, but she was neither. Only a woman still rooted in something older than pain. As the rest of the world burned quietly, she lit no lantern, sang no spell, only continued to stir the pot, to clip the leaves, to whisper into bottles as if the air still listened. Because for her, it did. The plague had taken many things, but not her rhythm, not her patience. And as the winds shifted, carrying with them the heavy breath of endings, she remained where ivy met ash, where forgetting met memory, and where silence was not absence, but attention. There was one herb tucked deep in the shadowed glade, where sunlight barely dared to wander, and the soil stayed cool, even in midsummer's breath. She called it the herb that remembered. No one else knew its name. Its leaves were soft as murmured prayers. Its scent like old rain caught in linen. It grew not from seed, but from silence. It needed no tending, only presence. She visited it once each year, never more, not to harvest it, but to sit beside it and listen, because it whispered, not in words, but in wait, in pause, in the aching hush between wind and stillness. In the final weeks of the plague, when even the birds no longer passed overhead, She returned to that glade. The forest greeted her with no fanfare, only a dampness on the bark, a hush in the moss, a waiting. She walked barefoot, so the earth might remember her shape, so the leaves might trust her footsteps. And when she arrived, the herb was still there, small, bowed, but not broken. She knelt beside it, not as a healer, not as a witch, just as someone who had endured. And the herb seemed to bow in kind, bending its small neck toward her palm. She did not pluck it. Instead, she whispered to it. A story carried in breath, a story not meant to be retold, but absorbed. For this herb, this green flicker in the dark, was a memory of all things forgotten, of those who had gone unnamed, unburied, unloved. And as her voice flowed low and slow, it did not echo, it did not vanish, it sank down into the roots, into the hush, into the soil that remembers better than any book. When she rose again, the wind had changed, a shift subtle and thin, but enough. Somewhere far beyond the trees, a door creaked open. A child coughed and did not die. A crow circled and flew south. The world had begun to breathe again, not with certainty, but with willingness. She returned to her cottage as she always did, lit no fire, sang no song, only poured water into a cracked clay bowl and watched the ripples until they stilled, until the past folded itself into the now, and the now softened its sharp corners, and time for a moment held no weight at all. And outside, beneath the trees, the herb that remembered kept growing quietly, faithfully, for those still to come. When the wind changed, it did not roar. It did not blow open doors or rattle shutters. It merely shifted, a turn in the unseen current, like breath returning after a long and dreamless sleep. The village remained still, charred wood, sunken roofs, chalk marks on stone, but deep beneath the broken floorboards, under years of dust and soot, the earth had started to warm, not with heat, but with hope. Hope did not arrive in fanfare. It came in the scrape of a trowel, the creak of timber lifted carefully from rubble, the hands of a boy barely 12 clearing the path where his mother once sold bread. His boots were too large, his coat still carried the scent of sickness and salt, yet he worked slowly, deliberately, not to restore what had been, but to make space for something new. Above him, in the cold light of early dawn, stood a woman with hair like faded iron. She was not his kin. They had never spoken before the silence had fallen, but now she passed him bricks. One by one, in silence, a quiet pact, in another ruin. 2 valleys over, a man who had once been a priest sat with a hammer in hand. He no longer gave sermons, no longer wore robes, but he shaped wood with a reverence that echoed prayer. And in the village square, where weeds once grew tall and wild, someone had planted lavender. It did not belong to anyone. It had simply appeared, its violet blossoms defying the ash. Children began to walk the paths again. Their laughter was unsure, shy, as though afraid to echo too loudly in this new world. But still, they laughed, and the walls that rose from the dust and splinters were not replicas of what came before. They were simpler, stronger, built with fewer hands and quieter hearts. Every nail driven was a word unspoken. Every beam raised a vow, not to forget, but to carry forward, to hold what had been lost, without letting it weigh them down. To build, not in resistance to the past, but in rhythm with the earth that had cradled both the living and the dead. Ashes beneath the floorboards, lavender in the square, a breath of wind that no longer carried sorrow, but song. The hammer rang like a distant bell, soft and rhythmic, echoing gently between bare stone walls. It was not the clamor of cities, nor the sharp strike of war. It was gentler, measured, almost shy. Each sound seemed to ask permission of the silence, as if afraid to wake the ghosts who still lingered in the corners of broken windows and crumbling gates. There were no grand plans, no architects, no blueprints, just memories and mud, wood salvaged from barns, iron reshaped from tools left behind by the vanished. The people did not speak often, not out of fear, but because the hush was sacred. They had lived too long with the howl of sorrow, the wail of grief, the endless rustle of fabric wrapped around the lifeless. Now, in the early rebuilding, even a cough seemed loud. Even laughter, rare as rain, was tucked behind palms as though unsure if it was allowed. The men who once rode horses to battle now pushed wheelbarrows full of stone. The women who once poured wine at feasts now stirred mortar with thick arms and distant gazes, their hands lined. From weeks of stitching shrouds, children no longer asked what had happened. They only asked what could be planted and when. The seeds went in quietly, row by row, beans, turnips, a handful of wheat pressed deep into soil that remembered everything. Even the animals seemed unsure whether to trust the quiet. Birds watched from soot-black rafters, then flew low, settling on branches that had begun to bud again. There was no declaration of recovery, no line drawn between then and now, just the slow, uneven rhythm of life returning in breathless, careful steps. In one corner of a chapel that no longer held services, a small bell was found, cracked but still capable of sound. A child touched it, and it rang once a clear note that hung in the air like mist at dawn. And the villagers turned their heads, not in fear, but wonder. For in that one soft sound, they heard something they had not heard in years, possibility. Not salvation, not joy, not yet, but the beginning of something that might grow. The threads of renewal were woven quietly, like dew gathering on autumn leaves, like breath held between two heartbeats. No trumpet fanfares, no grand parades, just hands, calloused and careful, mending what had been torn. The seamstress sat by her window, stitching scraps of cloth into blankets, patches of color, Against the dullness of gray, her fingers moved slowly, weaving stories into thread, stories of hope, stories of survival, stories whispered by the wind. Nearby, the blacksmith worked, hammering sparks into the dark. Each strike was a note and a song of repair, a rhythm that stirred the bones of the broken earth. He shaped horseshoes, not for war, but for carrying seeds, for plowing fields, for steady steps. On uncertain paths, in the fields, farmers tended soil, turning the earth gently, as if waking it from a long sleep. The rains came softly, washing away ash, nourishing roots, bringing life back. To the barren, children played in the streams, their laughter like silver droplets falling over stone. The village was not the same. It bore the scars of loss and silence, but within those scars was the seed of something new, a quiet strength, a gentle promise. The past was held tenderly, not as a burden, but as a guide. And as the sun dipped low, casting violet shadows, across the hills the village settled into a peace that was hard-won, fragile and real. As the day faded into dusk, the village settled beneath a sky, painted in deep purples and soft violets, a gentle cloak, woven from twilight's breath, the stones of broken homes, now cleaned and stacked with care, caught the fading light, their rough edges soft by time's patient hands. Smoke curled lazily from newly built chimneys, carrying the scent of fresh bread and herbs, reminders of life returning. In simple, sacred rituals, families gathered quietly, their faces shaded in shadow, voices hushed like a lullaby, each word a thread in the fabric of rebuilding and hope. Children, no longer afraid, chased the last glimmers of sunlight, their laughter a gentle echo among the old trees, telling stories of survival without needing words. The stars began to pierce the velvet sky, twinkling softly, watching over the village's slow healing. And beneath that vast, calm sky, the earth whispered promises of growth, of renewal, and of peace. Here, in the quiet evening, among reclaimed stones and tender hearts, the story of the plague's shadow ended not with sorrow, but with the steady, slow bloom of tomorrow. The dawn comes quietly, not with thunder or fanfare, but in soft, gentle light filtering through cracks in broken walls and worn shutters. It spills like honey across cold stone floors, touching the dust and waking the shadows that have long lingered. In the village, a child stirs, not with the fever that once gripped her breath, but with a slow, steady pulse of life returning. Her eyes open to the pale morning, uncertain yet curious, like the first time the world remembers the sun. Outside, the air carries the scent of damp earth, new growth, and something tender. Hope. The houses stand not as ruins, but as shelters, not as reminders of loss, but as homes rebuilt with hands that refused to forget. A figure moves silently through the narrow streets, an elder, cloaked in weathered fabric, walking with careful steps. Their face is shaded, hidden beneath a hood, but their eyes carry the weight of years and the light of resilience. They pause at a door, knock gently. A child answers. A smile, slow and shy, breaks across the face. No words are spoken. None are needed. The dawn is a promise, not just of light, but of beginnings, of life that grows slowly through cracks and shadows beyond the village walls where the wild grass swayed softly. A garden began to stir. It was not the grand gardens of kings or nobles, but a humble patch tended by patient hands. The soil, once heavy with ash, now breathed slowly welcoming seeds. Like old friends, rows of green began to push upward, tender shoots of herbs and flowers, their colors muted. In the soft morning light, lavender, sage, and thyme danced quietly, with clover and wild rosemary, a fragrant chorus carried on the breeze. Bees buzzed lazily, returning to blossoms that had waited patiently for their touch. And in the garden's center, a single young tree grew fragile, yet determined. Its leaves were a pale green, almost translucent, catching the light like whispers. This garden was more than soil and seed. It was a symbol, a testament, that even after the darkest nights, life could awaken again. The gardener, a woman with hands weathered by years of tending, watched quietly, her breath slow and steady. She did not rush the growth. She knew that healing, like the garden, came in its own time, and as the sun climbed higher, warming the earth, the garden thrived, a quiet miracle in a world learning to breathe once more. Down a quiet path of cobblestone, lined with moss and memory, stood a chapel, small, weather-worn, forgotten by time. Its wooden doors, once painted in colors of joy, were now faded, cracked by years of wind and silence. Inside, no candles flickered. No hymns filled the air, only stillness, only dust. The pews stood in patient rows, witnesses to prayers, spoken long ago, some in hope, others in grief. Light filtered through stained glass, casting gentle colors. On the cold stone floor, violet, rose, dusty blue. Each shard of color told a quiet story of saints and sorrow, of miracles whispered in the hush of despair. In the far corner, a cloak still hung on a rusted iron hook, untouched, its owner long gone. And at the altar, a single feather rested white, delicate, out of place, yet perfectly still. Perhaps it was left by a bird seeking shelter from the storm, or perhaps it was a sign left behind by something unseen. The chapel no longer needed sermons. Its silence spoke louder than any words, and in that silence there was peace. For in a world reborn, even an empty chapel held sacredness, not in ritual, but in the quiet echo of survival. And so the years turned, not in haste, but in hush, as the world softened under the lullaby of time. The plague, that cruel, unseen wind, had long since passed, its name no longer whispered, with trembling lips, but carried instead, in memory's quiet breath, What remained were stories, not etched in stone, or sealed in scroll, but carried in glances and gestures, in the silent gratitude for warm bread, clean water, and the nearness of another hand. The forest grew thick again, soft moss curling around the trunks of trees once stripped bare. Fields long abandoned blossomed in lavender and golden yarrow. The soil had rested, and in rest had healed. A new village stood on the bones of the old, not as defiance, but as a hymn to endurance. Children's laughter, once thought lost to grief, now echoed across the valley, light and unburdened. Old hands, weathered by sorrow, found new purpose in shaping wood, tending gardens, and weaving tailies for those too young to remember the dark at night beneath a velvet sky, scattered with gentle stars. Lamps flickered behind windows, not in fear, but in warmth, and if one listened closely through the hush of wind and hush of time, one could almost hear, beneath it all, a deep and timeless rhythm, the sound of life not rushing but returning, slowly, softly, surely, not as it was, but as it could be, fragile, tender, and infinitely precious, for the world had not ended. It had paused, it had wept, it had waited, and now it dreamed again.